This is Ace from Delta 2 Alpha, and welcome
to the Monks and Mavericks podcast. This episode of Monks and Mavericks podcast has been brought to you by Empower Supplements. You can find them online at impower.life. They produce AminoPro, the world's most bioavailable source of protein. It's halal, kosher, nut-free, dairy-free, gluten-free, and vegan-friendly. But more importantly, you can feel your life, workouts, and recovery with AminoPro and waffles. Use our code D2A10 and receive 10% off.
Internet gunslinger Phil Elmore come to join us, and he's gonna tell us about all the years of drama and hijinks that he's got himself into, and some of what he's got going on now, and a few interesting tips for navigating the internet at the end of it. This will be pretty lighthearted. I hope you all enjoy it. Phil, are you there?
Yes, I am.
So what got us to here? What led you to where you are now?
Well, ironically, I fell into writing. I went to school to be an accountant, of all things, and what my accounting degree taught me was that I did not want one. When I left college, I started working for my father's company. He was a technical writer. He started his business in 1987. So he not only trained me how to use a computer back in the old DOS days, but he taught me how to write, essentially. I went to college for accounting, but I also did a lot of writing work. I did an honors thesis that was a collection of short stories, which is the first collection of things I ever wrote in terms of fiction. So I also knew that I wanted to write fiction. I tried my hand at writing a novel. I started it while I was in college. Everyone gets one first novel, and they're all awful. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, they're almost always terrible. So you've got to exorcise that poison before you can do anything decent. I wrote another novel after that was not as bad, still awful. And eventually, while I was working as a technical writer over the years, after getting my initial experience with my father's company and then moving on to working for various other employers, I eventually managed to network my way into writing for Gold Eagle, which is an imprint of Harlequin, the romance novel company. They had a men's adventure imprint, and I wrote 22 different Executioner / Mac Bolan / Stony Man novels. The Executioner is notable as being the property that the Punisher was later sort of ripped off from, something that is widely acknowledged. And after I had written a few of those novels, I actually started to get good at it. So I've been writing fiction and nonfiction as both a freelance writer and as a technical writer, basically since I graduated college more years ago than I would like to think. I've been doing this for a long time now, and I work for a variety of freelance clients as well as direct employers, doing, again, fiction, nonfiction. There's really no genre I haven't done. Occasionally somebody will approach me about screenwriting work, and once I even wrote some poetry to spec. That was weird. So I spend a lot of my time I spend all my time at a series of desks. There's the morning desk, the daytime desk, the evening desk, and I type well over 100 words a minute because it's all I do. And you put a pen in my hand, I couldn't write you a sentence that you could read. That's the occupational hazard of typing for a living and spending all your time doing it.
So if I needed some emo, my girlfriend just dumped me poems written, I can just outsource that to Phil Elmore.
You could. I can't say it would be terribly good since haven't done a lot of that work, but I could.
Those Mac Bolan Executioner novels look like they'd be a lot of fun to write. Just
They
as far
are.
as basically the whole satire, just
Yeah.
insert explosion wherever explosion can fit.
If literature were snack food, these would be Twinkies. They are Twinkies for your mind. They're just junk food. It says something about the genre that it's basically just guy walks into a room, shoots everybody, walks out over and over again. I never wrote a novel, even though I wrote 22 of them. What I did was I wrote one chapter and then did that again and again, 20 or 25 times. And then what do you know? You've got a book when you're done. And it was fun the first couple of times. After that, it starts to feel like work. And I'm not complaining because, being able to publish commercial fiction is the dream of every author. And I got to do that over and over again. I've written a bunch of other books for various freelance clients. I've ghostwritten books, books that I can't take credit for, but that I know I wrote. And it's remarkably fulfilling. But at some point along the way, you realize this is work. And if you're getting paid for it, that's all right. A big mistake that a lot of aspiring writers and amateur authors make is that they think they're getting into it because of they want the cachet of being a writer. They want to experience what it's like to be a published author, and they think of it as very romantic and glamorous. It's not. It's not even a good way to make that much money. You really have to work your tail off. You have to hustle all the time if you're going to make a living as a working writer. And I draw a distinction between an author and a working writer. Anybody can be an author and crap out a novel or a series of short stories. Anybody can do that. And Amazon makes it possible for just about anyone to do that, as long as your politics aren't wrong. But to be a working writer and to make a living.
Bless their hearts, eh, Phil? Bless their hearts.
Yeah. To be a working writer and actually derive your income from it is considerably more work and considerably less glamorous. It's a lot like prostitution without all the dignity.
Well played. Well played. You can take a great deal of solace in knowing that in a fair number of fobs and different elements where the military and cops are involved, you'll find a surprising number of Mac Bolan novels.
Yes, and I've had actual soldiers contact me to tell me they liked something about a book that I wrote. And, because it was an open secret that it wasn't a secret at all, that is to say, that the Mac Bolan books were being ghostwritten by various authors. If you look on the copyright page, you can see the name of the author who wrote that particular book. And more than once, I had soldiers write to me and tell me they enjoyed a book. And I thought to myself, what could I possibly have to tell you, someone who has experienced combat for real, when I'm just writing this? It's fantasy for me. It's completely imaginary. I'm not a soldier. I've never been one. And, while I'm conversant in firearms and some of the mechanics involved, I'm as far removed from the reality of this as someone who is a soldier is not removed from it. So that was humbling to receive praise from people who really do that, who nonetheless enjoyed the books as escapism. I used to read those books avidly, and when I started writing them, I had to stop reading them because it became like work. I would start analyzing how the author did what he did rather than being able to enjoy the story. So I suppose in one tiny aspect, the tiny sacrifice of getting to live the dream of writing those books was that I could no longer enjoy them as fiction. I grew up reading them. My father had a collection of executioner novels in his library, and I read through all of them. And to look back and realize that one day that kid reading those books would get to write a whole bunch of them, that's an amazing thing. I'm incredibly grateful for that, and incredibly grateful for the opportunity. My editor at Gold Eagle was a fellow named Feroz Muhammad, who has since retired. He was the nicest, most patient man. He gave me a lot of great advice and had a lot of good things to say. But you could tell he'd been doing that job for a long time. And, when he retired, I'm sure it was, nice not to be in that grind anymore, because he spent all of his time reading material to evaluate it for republication or to make sure that it met the guidelines for submissions. And, it was a lot of work. So I owe him a great debt of gratitude for the help that he gave me. I've been fortunate enough to have a lot of great writing mentors over the course of my career. Not the least of which are the folks at League Entertainment, an IP company based in Florida that I've done a lot of work with over the years. So to have valuable and wise mentors who are not afraid to tell you when you suck is a powerful thing.
Yeah, the concept of mentorship is kind of lost on today's society, and definitely I've noticed with a lot of people now they're unable to make the they're unable to differentiate between I'm trying to tell you this so you can improve and be better versus I'm telling you this to hurt your feelings, and then they get their fifis all crushed.
Yes, and when I first started, especially when I started working with the folks from League Entertainment, the fastest way to make me angry was to criticize my writing. And I remember they told me, you're going to have to get over that fast if you want to go anywhere with this. You have to be able to accept criticism. And it was one of the most valuable pieces of advice I've ever received. I remember when I first started doing martial arts reviews of various materials, VHS tapes, that sort of thing. Scott Sonnen once said to me, you're going to have to grow a thick skin if you want to play with the grown-ups. And he was absolutely right. To get that to get that advice from more than one person in more than one context kind of tells you that it must be important and it's probably true. And I quickly learned that to get better, you have to be willing to accept criticism and not let it be personal. And more than that, it's a powerful thing to be someone's mentor because you have to be willing to hurt their feelings. People are going to get their feelings hurt. They're going to get upset. If somebody criticizes your work, it is going to feel personal. Writing nonfiction, when someone gives you a bad review or says something bad about your book, you can tell yourself it's because they don't like my opinions. Writing fiction, if someone doesn't like what you did, it's like they're attacking you as a person. I had a fellow executioner author tell me, well, Phil, free reviews are worth exactly what you paid for them. But you still end up thinking about them, and you still have to come to terms with that. It's very easy to say that everybody else is wrong, but it's much more productive to look at the criticism and say, all right, if I'm upset by this, is it because it's true? Have they struck on something that I know I'm weak in? Are they criticizing something that I know needs to be improved? And if that's the case, how do I get better? And that's good advice for everyone, for life. Be able to accept criticism and be able to channel that into productive effort to improve, rather than getting upset. Because getting upset never solves problems. Today, I try to allow myself only to be annoyed. I get annoyed about many things. I get irritated about many things. It's okay to be irritated. It's not okay to be upset, because being upset does not solve problems.
Absolutely, no kidding. And then we stop thinking clearly. And definitely with today's internet culture, there's some people that are just going to say mean things to you for the sake of saying mean things to you.
Yeah, and when I first started writing in the martial arts realm, and I made the mistake of doing muckraking martial arts journalism, I learned that fast. Because I made a lot of enemies, and it was a tremendous mistake to make enemies in that way. In some ways, I owe that rancor and that enmity for my rise to prominence in very tiny, very limited circles on the internet. When I first started my martial arts e-zine, The Martialist, if it weren't for the folks at McDojo, which became Bullshido, hating me and devoting like an entire subforum to hating me, I don't know as I would have become as well known as I did, because it's one of those perverse things that plagues humankind. No matter how badly someone is excoriated and criticized, there will be people who go, I should check that out. And we've seen it every day. Like, no matter how much you hate on the Guy Fieri's of the world, there are people who like him. There are people who go, I am going to watch that show. I'm going to watch this human troll doll eat garbage and have no taste about things. And they love it. So no matter how much someone demeans you or makes fun of you or criticizes you, there will be people who say, I'm interested, I'm going to look. And then when they look, they make their own opinion. I think we make the mistake of believing that the public at large, and let's call them consumers or audiences, however you want to address the demographics of the people who might be potential consumers of what you're producing, we tend to think of them as mindless robots who can't make decisions of their own. But of course, every single one of them is capable of independent thought, of making his own decisions. He may not be honest about what he likes. There may be people who wouldn't want to jump up and down and say, I like personality X, but they'll quietly consume that material nonetheless. And those people become your devoted followers, your readers, your listeners, your viewers. And that is how success is made in that realm. Anytime you're engaged in an endeavor that requires an audience, writing, reviews, reporting, you rely on those that massive silent people out there who may not stand up and actually stand up for you, but who are nonetheless listening to you. And so when you learn to write for them and to put criticism aside and say, well, yes, there are people who don't like me. And boy, you type my name into Google, you'll find a whole lot of people who don't like me. But they're not important. The people who are important are the people who actually consume the writing that I produce. And they don't always tell you when they like something, because human nature is such that we don't usually speak out unless it is to complain. But I've had enough affirmation over the years, and I've sold enough product over the years to know that those people are out there and actively buying.
It's interesting how the Streisand effect winds up creating a hydra in some sense, where you get to live rent free in their mind and just get free publicity.
Yes,
It's,
and it's tempting to say, whenever you're being ardently criticized by someone, it's tempting to say, oh, I'm living rent free in your head, man. But you have to also be able to look at things reasonably objectively and go, is this person obsessed because of some deficit in their character, or is this person obsessed because they truly ardently believe that what I'm doing is wrong? The owner of a particularly angry internet forum spent a lot of years criticizing me and seems to have fallen off the map in recent years. I don't know what became of him. But I once received a phone call during sort of the height of the feuding between that site and myself. I received a phone call from his ex-wife, who had all kinds of horrible things to say about him and thought I would be a receptive audience for them because he was criticizing me. And everyone wants to believe that their enemies are pathetic, insecure people with tiny manhoods, who are bad at everything. And that's certainly what she had to say. But objectively, I could look at that and go, this is a man's ex-wife. And therefore, I should view this advice with a certain amount of skepticism.
Well,
So
hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, right?
Yeah. So it was fun. And I never went out of my way to publicize that information had been given to me because, even among enemies, maybe there's some amount of guy code where you're like, I don't know if I want to tell the world that his ex-wife thinks his junk is too small. That seems mean, which is why I'm not naming him. But at the same time, I owe all of those critics a debt of gratitude, because if not for them, I would not have achieved the success that I have. And that's not, a hater's going to hate kind of a thing. That's just me acknowledging that the heat and light of any conflict draws viewership, draws readership. I do the same thing. When I go on YouTube, I love to watch people arguing with each other. And I may form an opinion on who I think is right. But at the end of the day, it's the back and forth that I'm interested in. I don't really care. I'm not making any far-reaching decisions or conclusions about the people involved. Eventually I might decide, I like it when this person is criticized because I find these characteristics annoying too. And there may be people who really enjoy a good article about why Phil Elmore is wrong about things. I don't know. More power to them if it gets my name out there. But over the years, I've really stepped away from that type of activity. I don't do that type of journalism anymore. So it's really, that type of criticism has slowed down considerably. I was actually stunned a couple of weeks ago. Some random YouTuber put up a video about opinions of mine he did not like. And he was complaining about stuff that was 10 years old. Like he woke up from a coma in an Antarctic research facility and realized he'd forgotten to hit publish on his video from 10 years ago. And so I talked to him. I'm like, hey man, let's not do this. I'd really rather not. I'm not in that place. I don't do feuds anymore. And I'd appreciate it if you didn't libel me. And he argued about it for a little while. And finally I said, look, if we do this, I've done this before. It's unpleasant. My life will be less well off, and so will yours. You will wake up every day wondering what legal means I have taken to diminish the quality of your life and harm the potential for your financial success. And if that means doing things like registering a website in your name, which you neglected to do so that I can tell the world why they shouldn't hire you, I'll do that, man. And I don't want to. So how about you take down the videos libeling me and we don't do this and we both go our separate ways? Because in the intervening years, I found that it's much better to be productive and constructive instead of engaging in this type of muckraking journalism that becomes internet feuds. It always starts out from a place of, I'm going to tell the world the right thing. I'm going to be, an Upton Sinclair type of expose writer. We all think that when we start down that path. But eventually, all muckraking journalism becomes a feud if you stick with it. And I admire those journalists who can publish a report like that and then break off and not engage with the follow-ups. But it's not easy to do because it's human nature to want to defend ourselves when we're criticized. So it's a much better idea not to do it at all.
On the topic of some of your internet feuds, how was it you found yourself fighting ninjas on the internet?
Oh, well, that again was the direct outgrowth of the type of muckraking journalism that I thought was a good idea. So, you write a negative product review of something by Ashita Kim, famed ninja of the 1980s, and suddenly you've made an enemy not only of Ashita Kim, but of all the people who call him a friend. And there are more of those than you might think.
Full disclosure, I may have owned more than one Ashita Kim book
But
myself.
that's just it. We all did. The first martial arts books I ever bought were Ashita Kim books. I remember buying one out of a used bookstore many, many years ago. And it wasn't until years later that I realized, hey, that's a real person. Ashita Kim, for your information, lives in Florida. He lives in a house that used to belong to his parents. He still has a landline. And when I called him, he answered. So, I've actually spoken to him on the phone and asked him, hey, could you not publish an entire chapter in your latest book that isn't true about me? And after a little bit of back and forth, he said, okay. He doesn't particularly like me. I don't have anything against him other than that, please don't publish things about me that aren't true. But in a way, I started it. I have myself to blame for having created that situation because I wrote a negative product review about somebody who, was likely to react badly. I did that more than once. There was some self-defense instructor in New England somewhere who had a keychain self-defense product that I thought was stupid. I bought the product, I reviewed it, and I said, hey, this thing is stupid. So he printed out a picture of my face, taped it to a pumpkin, and then filmed himself smashing the pumpkin with his keychain self-defense implement. You can't make this up. It's that ridiculous. When the police talked to him about, hey, you're essentially making death threats over the internet, his response was essentially, I don't care. And because it didn't rise to the level of a real threat, there wasn't anything they could do about it or would do about it. So we just kind of went our separate ways. And I learned a valuable lesson about picking fights with people on the internet. It's not a good idea. You do it in the martial arts realm, and you raise the chances that you're going to run into somebody who's a lunatic. Because as you well know, the martial arts industry not only attracts people who ought to be there, but also perversely seems to attract people who ought to be anywhere but there. Why is that? I don't know. It's like that old, does Dungeons and Dragons make your kid lose touch with reality? Well, no, but kids who are inclined to lose touch with reality will be drawn to Dungeons and Dragons. Nothing about the martial arts or the self-defense industry makes people lunatics, but there is a disproportionate number of lunatics who are attracted to it.
I myself never played Dungeons and Dragons. That was for the loser kids. I was a Magic the Gathering player myself, and it's much better, much cooler, much cooler.
You're carbon dating yourself by that too, because you can tell, when someone's in their adolescence, what escapist entertainment they got into. Sometimes you can tell. Although Dungeons and Dragons has been around for so long, I suppose it could potentially attack anybody.
No kidding. Yeah, no kidding. I think it came out of the 70s, didn't it? 70s or 80s? So.
I mean, it was in the 80s that I discovered it and that my generation would have been actively involved with it before the internet happened. So, we were all about that kind of thing. And I don't think it goes back much farther than that. I don't recall when they first published it. But in the years since, of course, I can remember there was sort of an internet when I was in college. It wasn't yet the real quote unquote internet, but we could communicate with people at other colleges through our VAX system at the university. I played a text-based multi-user game that was based out of Sweden, I think. Those were a thing even then in the very early 90s. I remember I went to college in the early 90s, and I remember when someone said, hey, did you check your electronic mail yet? And I said, my what now? Because I'd never heard of it before, and they had issued us all email accounts. And for a few months, I resisted calling it email because I thought that was stupid. I insisted on calling it electronic mail, and we see who won that battle. But, by the time I got out of college, everyone was on AOL by then, and the rest is history. But when I finally decided to start my first writing website, it was like the free website that you get with your AT&T internet access. And eventually it occurred to me that I was wasting my time and wasting my life, and that if I wanted to make myself a real writer, if I wanted to make this a career, I would need to hang my shingle out. And I started philelmore.com, and I started doing actual product reviews and writing and articles. That eventually became, like, I realized that I should specialize, that there was no reason anyone would be looking for philelmore.com, but I could specialize in martial arts material, for example, self-defense, survival. So I started The Martialist, and it spiraled from there. It was really a self-fulfilling prophecy. I decided I will be a writer, and then I started writing. And people said, well, how did you get started writing? Well, I just started writing. And that's not entirely true because, of course, at the same time I was working as a technical writer, and you can't not pick up valuable skills when you're writing to specification for other people, but they're all different genres of writing. So when I started doing freelance work, that's when I started picking up other things, and I was pursuing fiction at the time independently. After self-publishing my first 2 terrible novels, that's when eventually I got the job with Harlequin / Gold Eagle / Worldwide Library. And after that, I started writing for freelance clients and ghostwriting stuff. And once you get known for ghostwriting, there tends to be some networking, and you get other clients, you get referrals. I do a lot of academic work now, thanks to referrals for that type of work. You do a good job for one person in academia, and word gets around, and eventually people contact you and, hey, would you like to edit this textbook? And hey, could you do this, edit these online courses? And I even wrote some online courses at one point. I narrated one of them. I do a little voice work on the side. So there's an economics curriculum out there with my voice behind it. The best inception of all the different things I do, though, was when one of the internet marketers for whom I do quite a bit of content work bought an audiobook on some aspect of marketing, and it was my voice. So he contacted me. He's like, you'll never guess what I bought the other day. So that was the best It's a Small World After All moment in the various cross sections of the work that I do.
You have a few titles that have been written for I believe it's now defunct Paladin Press. Didn't they recently go under?
Yes, unfortunately, after a long and storied career, Paladin Press finally went out of business. Paladin's demise was not a surprise. A year or two before they went out of business, they sent out a letter saying, don't worry, you'll still get your royalty checks. And I thought, was that a question?
Oh dear.
So a number of years ago now, more than 10, I think, I'd have to look up the actual publication dates, I wrote the book Flashlight Fighting, which was the first book of its type at the time about using a small flashlight as a striking implement. Then I followed that up with the much maligned Street Sword, a stupid title for a book that was really just about how to use a longer edged weapon to administer force. But Paladin had this idea of how they wanted to market it, and Street Sword was, believe it or not, the least dumb of the titles they wanted to give it. So holding my nose, I picked that one from the list of titles they gave me that they would accept. The book was favorably reviewed by Tactical Knives magazine.
Despite what some people may think, Phil is not actually on the cover in a trench coat with a sword.
No, that
I regret
part's
to
true.
inform you there is no trench coat or fedora.
No, there's no fedora, but there is that. I am on the cover wearing a trench coat because it was winter, and I am holding a sword. But the book was only meant to be the book that I wanted to buy that I couldn't find, which was a book about basic longer blade mechanics. So I wrote that, and the book explicitly says, this is not a book about carrying a sword around. And then they gave it a title that makes everyone who looks at it think this is a book about carrying a sword around. And the book has achieved a kind of internet fame because it was made fun of in popular media. It was on Break.com. It was on Comedy Central's At Midnight television show where Chris Hardwick made fun of it. I actually had a fun exchange on Twitter with him. I wrote to him at one point to take issue with something else. And he's like, hey, why would you be insulting me? You're a nobody. He didn't say those exact words, but that was the intent. And I wrote back, yeah, Chris, it would be really weird to just start insulting somebody you'd never met. And I included a screen capture of him on At Midnight with my book behind him on the screen. And he wrote back something insulting, or tried to be. And I'm like, why don't you look at that picture just a little bit closer, Chris? And when he put together what I was telling him, he was like, oh, I'm so sorry. And he was really nice about it. So
well played, sir. Well played.
Yes, I had a good laugh about that. That was probably the best win I've ever gotten in an exchange on social media. But those books were a long time ago, and that was when I was foolish enough to think, I'm going to make it big in martial arts media. I'm going to write books about martial arts. Well, no. I am a best-selling author, but the reason I am a best-selling author is because I wrote a best-selling book on CPAP machines. So I've got that going for me. And, I've written other books that were successful, and I've written books that I can't admit that I wrote that were successful. But the book with my name on it that has sold the best, that was legitimately an Amazon best-selling book, was the book that I wrote after I almost died from untreated sleep apnea. And I wrote a little 99-cent booklet that I wanted to tell the world about so that people adjusting to sleeping with a CPAP machine could have the benefit of what I went through, things that I wish someone had taken the time to tell me. And the book really resonated because it turns out there are a whole lot of people with that problem. And so it became a bestseller. And I learned a valuable lesson about the ironies of life. You may be successful, and you may be successful after you put in the hard work to get successful, but it might not come in the form you were expecting, and you're just going to have to accept that.
The books from Paladin Press, you said you did Street Sword. You said you did Flashlight Fighting. Was there any others published with them?
No, those were the only two Paladin Press books that I did. To be honest, I made a lot more money doing freelance editing for Paladin than I ever did as an editor. I worked behind the scenes editing manuscripts for them for quite some time.
If somebody wanted to get copies of a lot of the old Paladin titles, have they been absorbed by another publisher?
Sadly, no. The rights to Paladin's library reverted to the original authors. So
Okay.
if those authors are still alive, like for instance, if I wanted to publish a new version of Street Sword today, I could do it. I've had people request that. It has, I've been very busy and it hasn't been top of mind. And if I did do it, I'd want to do it right and not, I'm kind of torn because on the one hand, I don't want to give it that dumb title, but on the other hand, that's the only reason people would be looking for it. So I opted for not doing anything at the moment. But there are other authors out there who are still active, who a few of them I think have made arrangements to publish their work through other publishers. Still others might be choosing to go the self-publishing route and can because, Paladin's gone. It's sad. It's sad to see that company go under, but so many publishing companies, Loom Panics, Delta Press, all of the alternative press type publication houses went under as a result of the pressures of a changing market where people simply aren't buying paper books anymore. And the publishing industry as a whole, it's much harder to make a living at it. When I was working for Harlequin, that was always an ongoing issue was, people weren't buying the series that I was writing for the way they used to. It used to be a staple. You used to be able to walk into any grocery store and find Gold Eagle, Mac Bolan books on the shelves for sale. And that stopped happening somewhere over the years. So the way consumers buy books has changed. The degree to which they do has changed. The format that they use, Kindle books supplanted first hardcovers and then paperback books. And that was a Rubicon in the publishing industry. And the publishers who were willing to adapt to the changing times did so. And a lot of them went by the wayside. I wrote for Harris Publications for many years. I wrote for a number of their magazines. For a number of Tactical Knives magazine was a Harris publication. I wrote for them for years. And my articles found their way into a number of different Harris gun and knife and that type of, I don't want to say military and law enforcement, but sort of topics adjacent to those, like one-off home defense publications and things like that, especially after Tactical Knives went under. Some of the articles that I had submitted that were originally for that got published in other outlets that were Harris Publications. The entire company, Harris Publications, is just gone. They just folded up because people don't buy magazines the way they used to. Now, some of their properties were purchased by, I want to say it's Athlon Outdoors, and they have some great publications, and I'm really happy to see them still successful. I published some work in Survivor's Edge is the name of the magazine. It's a survival publication, and that's a property of Athlon now. But the whole industry, the whole publishing industry is evolving and changing, and those companies that cannot adapt just die. It's a shame, but it's how it works.
It's interesting to see how people have adapted to that market. As an example, like you're discussing the magazines, there's a lot of magazines that just move towards trying to put out a cheaper and cheaper copy, cheaper and cheaper production value. And a couple of the magazines that are actually doing quite well went the exact opposite. So
Yes.
you look at specifically Recoil and Skillset magazine, who Ed Calderon, who I've come to get to know quite well. He's doing some work for them, and you're going through the airport, traveling as I am, and I see it on the shelves all the time. But when you walk up and you feel that paper just just the cover. It's got kind of got like an
Yes.
eggshell finish on it.
Yeah,
Like
you pick up.
it's just there's that tangible asset, and you're just like you pick this thing up, and you almost want to like hide it from somebody because it just has that feeling of value.
Yeah, you pick up a copy of Ballistic, and it feels like a paperback book almost. It's good stuff.
Absolutely. The the stuff with Paladin and Lumatics, Butokukai, Desert Publications, Delta, some of the ones that were publishing the alternative stuff, I was watching that from the sidelines when it was going on, and what really seemed to spark it off, and I'm interested your take on this, Phil, is there was a lawsuit, the infamous Hitman case, over some woman that had written a book that was converted into a how-to manual with stuff like put garlic in the hollow point when you're shooting people, and just a bunch of like kind of rather odd things that don't really make sense. And there was a lawsuit that kind of pushed the freedom of information or freedom of speech agenda, and then all of a sudden, everything from your poor man's James Bond to your anarchist cookbook to your stuff by Seymour Lecter, right? Like a whole bunch of the kind of how-to that was, I mean, really the heavy lifting of Paladin's lineup and those companies. All of a sudden, that stuff dried up.
Well, what happened with the Hitman lawsuit was they put out this book, Hitman, Diary of an Independent Contractor, I think it was called. And supposedly it was written by a housewife who just made up crap she saw on television. I don't know if that's true or if that's just mythology. Some guy bought the book, used it as a manual to be a hitman. He got paid by someone else to carry out a murder, got caught, of course, and the family of the victim sued. Paladin's insurance company chose to settle the lawsuit, so it never really got decided on First Amendment grounds. And Paladin was very unhappy about their insurance company settling the lawsuit, if I'm remembering all the facts correctly. As a result, they removed from their entire product line anything that fell into that category. So like their poor man's James Bond book, all of a sudden all the how to make explosives type stuff got excised out of it, and it was a much shorter book as a result. And I don't know as that had far-reaching implications for the industry, except insofar as it gave other publishers pause about, well, we might actually suffer some legal ramifications for doing this stuff. At the same time, of course, proliferating on the internet were all kinds of how-to documents that you used to be able to download from I remember back in the old Usenet days, you could download all this anarchy stuff and phone phreaking and all these other, largely apocryphal how-to manuals. There was one you could download it's all in ASCII text, and it's all about how to make your own atomic bomb. Like, good luck with the plutonium part. So, in some ways, the old internet was the frontier. You could do anything, be anything, learn anything. And now we're seeing, as the internet has become invaluable communications and social infrastructure, we're seeing more and more moves to clamp down on it, to censor it, to control it. And ironically, it isn't primarily the government that's doing that. It's the companies themselves. So you get these ongoing problems with social media, with Facebook, with Twitter, with the collusion among social media companies to deplatform the Alex Joneses of the world. If they can deplatform somebody you don't like, eventually they can deplatform somebody that you do like, which means eventually they'll get to you. It may take them a while because you're not on the top of the list, but they'll get to you eventually. And that's what happened with Gab.ai. It was an attempt to create an alternative to Twitter where you wouldn't get banned for having the wrong opinion. Naturally, some very unsavory people gravitated there because where else were they going to go? And then when this lunatic who committed the synagogue shooting, I believe it was found to have been spouting his anti-Semitism on Gab, somehow the social media platform was held responsible, and they had to change hosts, and they had to change registrars, or I can't remember if they did, but all of a sudden they're getting all of this deplatforming hassle from companies that should be neutral. It'd be exactly like if your phone company, or if AT&T said, you're not allowed to have a phone anymore because we don't like the things you talk about on it. Or your electric company said, we're going to turn off the power to your house because we don't We don't believe in your opinions. You're a hate monger and you can't have electricity. It's exactly like that. It's deeply disturbing. The solution, I don't believe, can be government regulation, because then you're just putting the jackboot on a different foot. Then the government can deplatform you if they want. The ability to regulate a thing is the ability to deny it. So I don't know what the solution is. I really don't, other than to demand greater courage from each of us as individuals. If enough people resist, if enough people say no, if enough companies say, no, I'm not shutting off his access just because you want me to, then maybe we'll get somewhere. But I don't like where it's headed. I really don't. It's disturbing. And that's how the internet has evolved over the years, to go from this wild frontier where freedom and just about anything was possible to yet another venue of control. And it's a venue of leverage, because the ability to deny you the internet is now the ability to seriously hinder your operating in life. Try to operate off the grid. Try not to have debit and credit cards, not to have PayPal, not to have access to an electronic means of payment. Try not to have email. Try not to have a website today and still do business. It's not easy. I would venture to say it's almost impossible.
I challenged myself to go credit card free for a bit. I was listening to some of Dave Ramsey's stuff, and he said, "Oh, you can do it. You can just get one of these debit cards." Well, I'm not sure how it is. I mean, I'm a dirty foreigner. I'm not in America, but I can tell you, I couldn't book a hotel or really any of it. It was couldn't rent a car, and I was using, like it said MasterCard or Visa on it, and it was supposed to be set up. I could just load money into it. I couldn't use it for a lot of internet shopping. I couldn't use it for a lot of these things. So now I'm forced to carry a credit card, which I just keep a super low limit on it, the lowest I can get, and load it that way. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like I grew up old school in a way where keep a couple $100 cash in your pocket, and you pay cash. Well, you go and try to rent a hotel motel. You walk in and it's like it's $60 for the night, but there's a $300 deposit if you are paying cash.
Yeah, exactly.
Talking about how you have how the companies are starting to kind of clamp down. A couple books that are becoming more and more relevant as the years go by, that talk about that kind of the way the internet goes and the rise of the corporate city state and stuff like that, by an author named Neil Stephenson. He wrote Snow Crash and Diamond Age, and they were published quite a few years ago. And each year, as I go back and kind of flip through that book, and as the events are changing, I wind up being confronted and slapped in the face with exactly how prophetic what he wrote was. It's fascinating to see.
Yeah. Meanwhile, you look overseas and they're using 1984 as their manual. And I read 1984 in 1984. So that's the dystopian fiction that I always look to when you see the encroaching of government censorship and government control on society. But more and more.
Was it April of 1984?
No, it was probably, I read it for English class, so it was most likely much earlier in the year. But I remember reading it and being fascinated by it, but also horrified. And reading that in junior high was what made me an anti-communist for the rest of my life. So to see not only government encroachment on freedom, but also to see private companies engaged in the same. Google talking about how it can be a good censor and clamp down on ideas that they don't like. Is seeing the push in popular culture to subvert reality. And anyone who doesn't agree with that subversion of reality is a hate monger. That's deeply disturbing stuff. There are times when I'm grateful that I'm closer to 50 than I would like to admit, and that I probably don't have more than a couple of good decades left in me, because, when I check out, it's going to be nuts. So, part of me is a little grateful for that, because 50 years from now, God knows what's going to be happening, as weird as it's gotten.
You were at one point writing for some more right-leaning publications. Did you wind up finding that you're getting a fair amount of backlash, or what was your decision to kind of transition away from doing that type of writing?
Well, I wrote for WorldNetDaily for 8 years. I wrote a weekly column for them every week without fail for 8 years. And I also did freelance reporting for them. And it just got to be a grind. It was having to put together a new idea, 1,000 words long, every week, week after week, year after year. After a while, you start to be like, I just want to stop doing this for a while. And so eventually I did. Along the way, I managed to make quite a few enemies. I used to get a lot of hate mail, not over the things you would think. I did end up getting mentioned by the Southern Poverty Law Center once in like one of their weekly hate updates or something. I'd written a column establishing why the Occupy Wall Street protesters were terrorists, because the area that they were camped out in, not only being, completely deluged with biological hazards as a result of their presence, but also like crime was out of control. Local businesses were suffering. And I argued that they were terrorists behaving as terrorists and therefore should be removed with force. And I used very poetic language. I said, send in the riot cops with their truncheons and remove these people. And without explicitly saying that I meant them for the biohazard cleanup, I mentioned flamethrowers. So, as you can imagine, a lot of people freaked out about that and said, Elmore is saying they should use flamethrowers on the Occupy Wall Street protesters. And that's not what I said. But at the same time, okay, I understand why you think that, even though it's wrong. But I was never really worried about that. Like, I had family members go, is that an issue? And I'm like, no, because the Southern Poverty Law Center is a hate group that does nothing but defame and libel anyone to the right of Mao. So if the Southern Poverty Law Center does not like you, you're doing something right. I was never worried about that. I'd be more worried if they were like, oh, that Elmore, he's a great guy. But what did get to me after a while were the crazies. I had one lady emailing me about the helicopters that were watching her. And I'm like, oh, I'm just not going to let that go by. I'm not going to answer that. I got hate mail about fluoride over and over again. I wrote what I thought was a throwaway column that essentially said, no, fluoride is not a Nazi-era mind control chemical being used to soften your resolve. And I thought,
sounds like you've had too much fluoride, bro.
Exactly. Well, Alex Jones' website, InfoWars, they did an open letter to Phil Elmore. The headline mentioned Be My Name. I don't think Alex Jones wrote that. It was written by other people, but they mentioned Be My Name. The title was An Open Letter to Phil Elmore, who thinks fluoride is good for you. And the whole point was, no, it's not. It's evil and wrong, and he's bad, and you're bad, and you should all feel bad. So I got more hate mail about fluoride than any other topic. And I went through several weeks where I was just debunking conspiracies. I went after chemtrails one week, got a bunch of hate mail about that, got a bunch more crazy mail from people who desperately wanted my help about things. But none of those things would have stopped me from writing for that website. I didn't have a crisis of conscience, even though it's a fact that when you're writing for any of those websites, what you're writing is outrage porn. You're writing something that is meant to make people angry. If you're not making people angry, you're doing it wrong. If you're not making people afraid, you're doing it wrong. There's a way to do that and do it honestly. And that's how I approached it. But it does get a little tiring. And the reason I stopped doing it was just because I got tired of doing it week after week. If I'd been able to, take a vacation and come back when I felt like doing it again, maybe I would have, maybe I wouldn't have. But, it was just time to move on. WorldNetDaily does a lot of great reporting. They cover a lot of topics that don't get covered elsewhere. And then there's the fringe weird stuff that all gets kind of sprinkled in. It's like really great piece of expose journalism. And then, is this prediction in the Bible going to come true? And it's like giving those equal weight, probably not the best idea for your news credibility. But I'm glad they're out there. I hope they stay in business. I know they've been doing some fundraisers recently, and I hope that doesn't mean that they, like so many publications, are having issues. I don't think they are. I know Jerome Corsi, who works for WorldNetDaily, was just recently in the news for this whole Russia collusion investigation, and I was shocked to hear his name again. I almost think I exchanged emails with him at some point years ago. I don't remember why I would have, but because he also worked for WorldNetDaily. But anyway, it was fun to do. I met a lot of great people that, I admire to this day. And it will always be a point of pride that I was a columnist for the same columns editor that Chuck Norris was a columnist for, because Chuck Norris either writes or wrote a column for WorldNetDaily. So that will always be a point of pride to me.
I myself quite enjoy a good conspiracy theory. Just if nothing else, is the intellectual exercise, and watching Alex Jones go I mean, people can say what they want about the man, and I mean, some people say he's a character actor, some people speculate he's a shill, some people think he's the real McCoy. But watching that guy spin up and how fast he's delivering and without hesitation, and how quickly he's recalling details, agree with him or not, that man has an exceptionally high IQ, and I find him entertaining.
He's basically
the
a living
conspiracy theories
meme.
are. He's definitely become become that. There's remixes on YouTube you can find that are techno songs done with "Make the Frogs Gay," which is definitely a good way to spice up your day a little bit if you're having a little bit of glum, right? Little bit of storm clouds. Let's go put that on and you'll feel better. But just as the intellectual exercise you have, whether it's flat Earth theory or whatever it is, and just going through and listening to someone's argument, and so okay, maybe that's somebody's half-hour argument, a half hour of your life, but some people pour hundreds and hundreds of hours into kind of this theory, and so for me, I just enjoy the intellectual exercise.
I think conspiracy theories are popular because they're comforting. And I know that might sound weird, something that sinister could be comforting, but conspiracy theories point to an ordered causal universe where bad things happen because bad people get together and purposely make them happen, however elaborate those plans might be. I think it's much more terrifying to live in a world where bad things happen purely because random acts occur, purely because we don't have any real control over the universe around us. If terrorists attacked the Twin Towers and brought them down, it's horrifying and terrifying to think we live in a world where 5 or 6 guys could get together and do that. It's much more comforting to think that the only way that happens is if there's some elaborate government conspiracy to bring it about and fool people in the bargain. So in my opinion, conspiracy theories are almost always false only because they're too easy. They're too comforting. The real universe is much more random and much more terrifying.
Well, the idea that we're on a big ball of rock hurtling through the ever-expanding abyss of darkness at several echelons or several orders of magnitude above breakneck speed, spinning at nearly the speed of sound. I mean, it's not something that something that we can come to terms with. And then on top of it, there's these asteroids and comets and alien spaceships and yeah, no. I'm just gonna worry about this little thing, this little bad guy, because that's more comforting to me.
Exactly.
Phil, why do you hate the homeless?
Well, the short answer is I don't, because I don't really hate anybody. But I did write extensively about the fact that the misplaced compassion we have for the homeless people masks the very real personal security threat that the average homeless person represents. So, for example, you are never more vulnerable than when you are in your car with your seatbelt on, with your window down in traffic, especially if you're not able to drive away because there are cars in the way. And yet every day across the country, people will roll down their window to hand change to a guy standing on a street corner or at an intersection or at an off-ramp because he's begging for money, and we want to feel good about ourselves and be compassionate. In my opinion, that misplaced compassion is only raising the chances that you are going to get mugged or stabbed with a dirty syringe or any of a number of horrible things that happen all the time that the average homeless person does do and can do, because you don't get to know if he's one of the nice ones or one of the crazy ones or one of the hostile ones. You just don't know. So it's simply a matter of playing the odds. And I've written booklets over the years about that, that I got a lot of grief for. But I've also made some great contacts that way. One of my best writing friends and contacts was somebody who herself gave a famous TED talk on what it was like to live out of her van. And she contacted me at one point about using some of the material that I had published on the topic. And we ended up becoming friends as a result of that. So it's an odd topic because people so often want to virtue signal about it rather than approach it rationally. But the sad fact is, you show compassion for people by leaving them be, not by making yourself more vulnerable, not by leaving yourself open to physical attack. So, the average guy who insists on sitting with his back to the wall whenever he's at a restaurant because God knows something tactical could happen, that guy somehow thinks nothing of handing $1 through his window at a guy outside the car who could easily beat his head in if he wanted to. I just think to be consistent, we have to acknowledge that that security threat exists. And, added to that is the fact that there are so many violent incidents involving the homeless. The probability that you're in danger when interacting one of them is much higher than when you're interacting with a member of the general public. That's just the nature of the beast. Many of them have substance abuse issues. Many of them have mental health issues. Many of them have communicable diseases. Saying this is not hatred. It's simply a fact. It's a statistical fact. So if you're playing the odds, you're in danger. And I used to regularly go downtown in my city, which had a terrible, terrible, aggressive panhandling and homeless problem. Every time I went down there, I added to my repertoire of stories yet another homeless altercation story. I saw so many awful things. There was one woman who even got stabbed by a homeless man, and she wrote a letter to the paper and said something like, the one time a homeless person stabbed me, I didn't blame him. I blamed the society that allowed him to come to that pass. I'm like, no, lady, that guy stabbed you. Blame him.
That's some Stockholm syndrome shit. Wow.
Yeah. So in writing in opposition to that mindset, I ended up making a lot of people angry. And I get why, but that outrage does not move me. It's just a fact, and I'm going to keep saying the truth. I haven't written on that topic in a really long time, but I used to. And yeah, people didn't like it.
Where I was living a while back, which is Canada for most of you that don't know. So if you own a convertible, you get to use that convertible and have the top down about 2 months of the year. And so two fellas were driving down a main drag through an area we called Alphabet Soup. It's not quite the hood, but it's the who. And they're at they wound up having the rag top down at a traffic light, and some guy runs up and stabs the passenger in the neck with a syringe and injects him and says, "Don't worry, it's good for you." And they're like, oh my God. So they rush him to the hospital, and I don't know where this person got it from, but not only did the guy not get diseases, he essentially injected him full of vitamins. It was like B vitamins that he wound up injecting him with. Out of all the things to get stabbed, injected with in a syringe by some cracked out whatever, he got hit with and injected with a bunch of vitamins. It was essentially the guy like free-based multivitamins and put in a syringe, and the syringe was clean. And that was in a place that's approximately 300,000 people. Now it was probably about 250 then, and in friendly Canada. So that thread definitely exists.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
What do you make of kind of the rise of the talking heads, people like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and Weinstein? You're starting to see even Sargon of Akkad and some of the YouTube personalities. You're starting to kind of see a rise of the online philosopher again. What do you make of all that?
Well, you're not just seeing a rise of it, you're seeing a fall as well. Sargon of Akkad, aka Carl Benjamin, I believe he's English. He got very popular. Him if you'd like. Well, he got very popular very quickly, and then started to get into politics locally where he was. Then had some hit pieces done on him in the local media that painted him as a horrible racist, and he almost immediately backed off and almost said, "No, I'm giving up this political stuff. I'm going to do other things." And it was definitely like pulling away from the hot stove after you've touched the burner. Jordan Peterson has become immensely popular and is being held up as this thought leader, I guess you'd call it. And then went so far as to say something remarkably stupid about how Judge Kavanaugh should have resigned, even though he was probably innocent because reasons. And that hurt him. And so I think the rise of the talking heads, it indicates both a desire on the part of the public to have intellectual conversation and debate. There's a thirst for that out there, but also it shows how incredibly mercurial the public's loyalties can be. No one agrees with someone all the time about 100% of things. And yet all it takes to lose a certain percentage of your viewership is for them to realize they disagree with you about something. Make one mistake, because we are all fallible, and suddenly you're on the downslope of fame. And fame itself is lightning in a bottle. You never know when somebody's going to throw the lever and suddenly decide that your career is on the downswing instead of the upswing. The media contributes to that. They love to build people up so that they can take them down, but it's not like it's a conspiracy. That's just human nature. So it's fascinating to me to watch the rise of various intellectuals and this new category. It's not really new, but the renewed interest in the category of discussion and debate. Only to then see what happens to the people who are at the center of that activity. I'm old enough to remember when Phil Donahue used to do intellectual conversations on his talk show. But then the video talk show became the purview of the freak show. People have forgotten that Oprah Winfrey rose to fame doing freak shows, doing weird topics, doing the type of tabloid journalism that would later be associated with the Jerry Springers and the Richard Bays of the world. But she did. It was only after she got popular that she switched over to the more Oprah format that we identify with her today. Meanwhile, the Phil Donahues of the world struggled to keep up. I remember an embarrassing episode where Donahue was doing his show wearing a dress or something, like a skirt. But Donahue could not keep up because his staid image just did not lend itself to transforming into that type of freak show that people seem to want. So the public wants intellectual debate until it doesn't, and it loves a personality until it doesn't. And those rises and falls happen incredibly quickly, sometimes when you least expect them.
As some of the old school folksy wisdom that my father instilled in me growing up, he said, "Son, you can build 100 bridges, but there's 5 minutes of impropriety with a goat, and they won't remember you as a bridge builder."
Exactly. I set my brother's lawn on fire once, just once, but ever after, you're the guy who can't be trusted with the accelerants.
Well, I mean, he shouldn't have mouthed off, and you wouldn't have been in the process of burning his field and salting his land. Right? Like, all of these things are avoidable. He should have thought about the choices he made that led to that. So what is it that we're doing now? We're not writing for WorldNetDaily. You said that you've kind of backed off a little bit from the Harlequin stuff. Is that they've kind of shut that venue down? What's the current project you're working on, Phil?
Well, right now I spend a lot of time working for a number of internet marketers doing content work and logistics work. I also do a lot of academic work and academic editing. I've been incredibly busy with those activities. I do some work at thesurvivalist.us, which is my survival site, and I still publish through the martialist.com, which is my martial arts and survival and self-defense website. Most of my work time, though, has been spent doing freelance for a number of different clients. I've just been incredibly busy these last several years and making pretty good money, developing content, contributing a lot of chaff to the internet, I would call it. I guarantee you have read a website that I have contributed to. I think I could say that of just about anybody reading or listening to this, just because there's been so much. One of the greatest ego moments I ever had was somebody wrote online that there were two constants to the internet, porn and Phil Elmore, and never the twain shall meet, thank goodness. But I've been incredibly prolific over the course of my career.
Deep fakes are a real thing, Phil.
Well, yeah, that's true. And nobody needs to see that. But I do so much work behind the scenes now. It's gratifying in a way to be able to use my skills and get paid writing, but not have any kind of opinion attached to that. It's kind of nice. So, to sort of wander into the realm of public opinion again, not something I'm really looking to do, although it's unavoidable in some cases. I mean, if you have any kind of profile at all, you're going to end up occasionally making the wrong enemy. I upset another writer once a couple of years back on social media, and he wrote a series of blogs about what a jerk I am. And turns out he's got a really popular blog. Well, I just wrote to him one day and I'm like, hey, I'm not really looking to sue you. That's not what I'm writing about, but could we not, like, this is, you're being really mean, and I don't really feel like what I did wrong kind of rises to that level. Could you not? And he said, okay. And that's when I learned that, 9 times out of 10, if you just reach out to people like a human being and you stop going out of your way to pick fights with people, you're much better off on the internet. Now that 10th guy, you can't stop him. There's not a lot you can do about that. And so you will have to be prepared.
So how do you wind up dealing with that? Just ignore him? Just
Well,
block?
it depends. It depends on the individual. There's one guy who I wrote an article about many, many years ago who's been obsessed with his hatred for me, and not just me, with a number of other people ever since. That particular fellow is now in jail awaiting trial on federal firearms charges, but you can't always count on your enemies blundering into their own problems with the law and taking themselves out of circulation that way. So you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. The best advice I could give anybody about dealing with mean people on the internet is, A, don't pick fights with stupid people or with crazy people, because you can't undo that once you do it. Once you get into a feud, everybody's life is worse off. You're wasting time dealing with that feud. Even if you win it decisively, you still had to deal with it, and you wasted time doing it. And finally, if you want to keep a secret, don't tell anybody. If you use social media, don't use it to vent your unhappy feelings. Don't vague book. Don't subtweet. Don't go on the internet to complain about your life, because anytime you do that, you are giving people who don't like you ammunition they can use against you. If you're using social media at all, you should be using it to manage your image as a human being, to tell the world what you think in a positive, constructive way, and never to vent your negative feelings or your unhappiness. We all get that way. We all feel that way sometimes. But telling that to the public and social media never helps. If you have friends you want to talk to them directly. Get their advice directly. Get their help directly. Don't go on social media and whine about your life, because it only makes you look worse and feeds the people who don't like you if you've made enemies along the way.
For me, I have a pretty firm policy of I won't even text someone about something that's bothering me. I keep my cards pretty close to the vest and a very, very close circle. But anytime I need advice, I won't even text. I won't do anything in a way it can be screenshot or reproduced. I will typically talk to that person in person, just because otherwise it's very easy for it to come back and bite you.
Yeah.
You can have chat logs printed and things like that, and it happens very, very quickly.
Absolutely.
And I know you're a busy man, Phil, so we're gonna get going, but I want us to leave us with one last thing. What is the quote that you find yourself reflecting on the most, or has influenced you the most over the years?
Well, I have a number of maxims that I go to frequently, that I treat as personal slogans, things like nothing succeeds so much as success, and I can justify anything in 3 paragraphs or less. It's better to get forgiveness than permission, or easier to get forgiveness than permission. But the one quote that I always go back to that helps me keep everything in perspective is the statement, "Sufficient to the day is the evil thereof." So many of us go through our lives borrowing trouble and worrying about things that either never come to pass, or if it's something you're worried about, you should be dealing with it preemptively. You should be going forward towards the danger and confronting the problem, or preparing to deal with the problem, instead of just worrying about it. If you're just worrying about it, if you're just fretting about it, if you're borrowing trouble, then you're only making the quality of your life worse. And I wish I'd learned that lesson a really long time ago. A few years ago, I had to face every one of my worst fears all at once. And it culminated in being told that my untreated sleep apnea had done damage to my heart, and that, in a roundabout way, you're being told, hey, you might die. It wasn't quite that imminent, and I've since gotten better after, getting CPAP therapy and being treated for the problems, and my heart has gotten better, and all is well. But at the time, I was at the lowest point I'd ever been in my life. I had faced a number of personal issues culminating in that. And that was when I realized that worrying never solved any of those problems. I didn't deal with the issues when I should have. And so instead of going forward towards the danger and dealing with them, I put them off or avoided them and worried about them instead. So Sufficient to the day is the evil thereof, but you should also be dealing with your problems preemptively, constructively, and actively.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you so much.
Those are rock solid words. I appreciate everyone tuning in. This is kind of a lighthearted podcast. Kind of mix up some of the more serious stuff we've talked about. If any of you have some questions, even if they're troll questions, we'll bring Phil back on and he'll shoot from the hip, which he's pretty good at. So if you have any questions for Phil, leave us a comment or send us a DM, and we'd gladly have him back on. Phil, we really appreciate you joining us. It's a pleasure, and
I appreciate
we will
you
talk
having
sooner
me.
than later, sir.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care. All right. Are you there,
Hey.
Phil?
Yep, I'm here.